We're here today with Wei Shen, who's Professor of International Business and Director of the Confucius Institute at the University of Lancaster in the United Kingdom. And thanks very much for being here, Wei. We've asked you to join us today because of your expertise in student mobility and higher education issues. And I've got a series of few questions I'd like to ask you, if that's okay.
My pleasure.
Okay. What do you see as the key trends, I wonder, in higher education today?
As you said, Rebecca, my area of expertise is international student mobility, and I've been working a lot on migration of students and academic staff. And I see really increasingly nowadays students are very mobile. I think they are more willing to take the challenge to study or live abroad. And however, it's quite interesting to see that originally it was very south-north phenomenon, meaning that developing country students going to the developed countries. So you have a few countries like the United States, Britain, Australia, who are very popular destinations. But increasingly, we also see a regionalization, meaning that the students are very likely to stay within their own country or their own geographic regions. And especially with the financial crisis, one very good example is you look at Korean students. They used to study English in Australia or in the US. But increasingly, because the financial burden is so high, the Korean currency has gone down. You see many of them have decided to study in China or in the Philippines. And English, for instance, is a very popular subject to study in the Philippines because the language, it's a very commonly spoken language, and also Filipinos has very good English ability. And so the city of Cebu now is the home for many Korean students in the region. So you see the regionalization, which is interesting. And also some developing countries are becoming very popular destination. And here China is a very good example. China used to be a net sender of international students, but now it's also net receiver, meaning more students are going to study in China rather than going abroad. And another thing is the feminization of the student population. We see a lot more participation of female students. And it's actually quite interesting. I did research on Chinese students abroad. And one of the reasons that many of Chinese students decided to go to study in the UK, particularly for the female students, is the study program is shorter, especially for master degree. It's only 1 year. So many of them can actually come back to get married on time before they are too old and out of the market. So you see this mobility also provides students, female students, the opportunity to go and study abroad. And these are some of the trends I have observed.
I know, Wei, that you've got a very interesting background yourself in that you're from China. I know that you've lived and worked in a number of European countries, and you now work in the UK. I'm wondering what kind of different attitudes you see towards mobility kind of across all the places you've lived and worked and studied.
I think for me, the mobility has really been the most important factor of my academic career, because, as you said, I have lived, I think, around 6-7 European countries for either work or studies or both. And I think that's really important because that opens so much more opportunities. However, mobility is not the same for each country. And take Holland, for instance, the Netherlands. Mobility is almost taken granted because the country is so small. And when you're born, you have to work or study abroad. And the other case, like the UK, mobility is kind of problematic because for the British students, going abroad, it's almost like almost ask them to do something very hard. You know, when I go to, actually I went some study fairs in the UK to get, high school graduates to go to study in the university where I did my PhD. And I remember that one of my colleagues always joke when we go to London, he told the students that you don't need to get your passport to travel outside M25. And I think that's the attitude, because I think British students are very attached to the area where you were born and raised. So mobility for them is very foreign. And however, in some countries in the continent, it's much more common. I think it's to do with the geographic proximity, the size of the country. And on the other hand, on China, mobility is viewed as a very important success factor for your career. Because actually, we said to the students who have studied abroad in the 90s or early 2000s, we say it's almost like gold plating. When you go abroad, you kind of cover yourself with gold because you have got a foreign degree, which is something very different from your peer group.
So it's a way of getting social capital.
Exactly.
Capital.
You accumulate the social capital. The degree is part of the social capital, but more importantly is the social network, the intercultural competences.
How do you think UK students might be encouraged to shift to become more mobile?
I think first of all is the language issue. I think many British students are very in their comfort zone because English is the most widely spoken language. And I think language education hasn't been that successful in the UK. And you see many language departments are declining, especially in modern European languages. So I think we should invest more in language education because in that way, the students will feel more comfortable when they go to study abroad. And you see that comparison with UK and France and UK and Germany, where in France and Germany, foreign language education play a much more important role than the UK.
Okay, Wei. Well, you're an associated partner on our EU-funded project, which is called UNIKE, Universities in the Knowledge Economy. And we're interested in the ways in which students might be being enrolled to become knowledge workers in that economy, and the way in which universities are being encouraged to produce those workers and produce that kind of knowledge. Is this something you see happening in the context in which you're working? And I wondered what you think the implications are of those kinds of changes for how we conceive of a university and what a university is.
I think it's a very interesting question that you have pointed out. I mean, if we look at modern universities, I think it's very different from what we originally thought, or about university. University is more about a knowledge factory rather than at the place where intellectual training, debates take place. I think in the current context, the students are very much trained in a specific educational goal, which they have specific programs to train them, rather than give them a broad overall knowledge base. And I think there are pros and cons. I mean, the pros are obviously the students have more specialist knowledge in the area that they are interested. But what you see in a lot of the contexts where I have lived or worked, the students have very few general knowledge about the world. I mean, they may be very good at counting, but if you want to talk to them about politics, about European history, they know nothing, because it's partly how the program is set up. They have to study shorter. If you look at Germany, they used to have 4 years diploma, and now it's 3-year bachelor projects. So they have to condense, and a lot of the journal.
That's Bologna, isn't it?
It's with the Bologna. I think it's a tricky. But on the other hand, you see also the students intend to stay in university longer also because they want to get more degrees. To accumulate, because maybe what they feel the bachelor degree is not sufficient. So I think there are pros and cons on how the university have shifted.
Okay. I'll ask you an unusual question, because this project's very much about critiquing what's happening in university reform globally. I was wondering what you might be able to offer me in terms of positive outcomes of the way in which universities are changing.
I think partly the university have been very sensitive to the social change. I mean, we also see the university have been more accessible to the public, to the general public. So you have a lot more what's, in the UK is called widening participation. In China, we call the massification of higher education. So education is not anymore the ivory tower, has become more accessible.
But that's come at a cost, hasn't it?
It has come at a cost. So I haven't finished. And that's also resulted in what I see in China, diploma diseases, because people, the diplomas are inflated. And so that's also a negative consequence also.
Is there any way we could have got those advantages of widening participation, as we call it, massification, without the cost to students?
I think then we have to look at more what kind of education we are providing. I mean, higher education doesn't have to be university education. That can also be professional technical education, which I see that's a very successful case in Germany, which the students can actually be enrolled in higher education, but with a very technical knowledge, which meet their expectation and will result less burden on the job market. You know, the whole idea of apprenticeship, it's very useful and nice. But
so how would you say we would kind of meet the needs of the so-called knowledge economy, whilst giving students a good experience, not exploiting them through fees, and ensuring that there's good, fair access for them? That sounds like a big ask.
It's a very big question. So I really, my honest answer is I don't have a simple answer for that.
Yeah.
But I think what we are seeing in some other trends is digitalization of education. Maybe that could be a way to promote more alternative ways of enrolling higher education, not then, you know, enter this resource intensive.
Do you think universities need to keep to the idea of the credential, of the 3-year degree with the certificate at the end, or could we have a much more flexible way of people learning in universities without necessarily being on these set-piece programs?
I mean, obviously it would be good if we can manage that, but as I said earlier, since today it's the inflation of diplomas, everyone wants to be equipped, would be armed with a piece of paper. I mean, it's not only a decision for the university, but also for the widening wide society, for the private sectors, you know, whether they can recognize this training, non-formal education. But I think nowadays we are just...
we need to be imaginative.
Yes.
Finally, you're director of the Confucius Institute at Lancaster, and I understand there's a network of those across the world now. I wonder if you can tell me a little bit about the work of the Confucius Institute and how that contributes towards the reshaping of higher education.
And Confucius Institute is a relatively kind of unique higher education product or cultural diplomacy. It started around 10 years ago, which is a tour by the Chinese government to promote its language, the Chinese language, and also studying China. And it's a cultural diplomacy, public diplomacy tool. It's unique because it's not like the traditional language institutes such as Alliance Française or Gothic Institute. It actually covers different aspects. It covers language education, it covers scholarship, it covers, you know, cultural activities, and the institutional setup is very unique also because it's a joint venture between the local foreign university, so in my case Lancaster University, and a Chinese university. So in our case it was South China University of Technology. So it's a very interesting institutional setup also. And so far it's been very successful. It has over 400 Confucius Institute in 126 countries. And I think partly it's to do with the rising demand for learning Chinese. And many of the Confucius Institutes are very successful in generating also income from the activities, for instance, London School of Economics.
So it sounds as if it's a way of kind of deepening ties beyond just lots of Chinese students coming to the UK.
Yes, I think that's the whole idea, is to make it a two-way traffic, to make the mobility both from China to UK or other countries, but also attracting foreign students to go to study in China. So
it's a kind of deeper globalization.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay. Wei, thank you so much for your time today.
It's a pleasure,
Rebecca. Talking to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.